Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the web meeting of the Renewable Thermal Alliance, the RTA, which today is dedicated to the Electrification Future Study. My name is Helle Grønli, and I'm affiliated with the Yale Center for Business and Environment, and I am also the coordinator of the RTA. The Renewable Thermal Alliance was initiated by the Connecticut Green Bank, NYSERDA, and Yale University in 2016 to catalyze and scale a regional market for renewable heating and cooling. The RTA is a multi-state network of market participants, which has grown to near 300 individuals. The RTA engages stakeholders such as policymakers, installers, manufacturers, finance, and utilities, and is organizing web meetings as part of how we engage to share insight and best practices in the sector. Before I introduce today's speaker, I will provide some practical details and updates from the RTA, and starting with the updates. As you may recall, in January, NYSERDA submitted an application for a DOE grant with the purpose of developing a performance data clearinghouse, and this clearinghouse is named OTherm. The OTherm project was developed through the RTA network, engaging various stakeholders and also building on prior dialogues in the broader RTA community. In September, DOE selected OTherm, and NYSERDA and DOE are currently negotiating terms for an award. So just stay tuned for news on that. The RTA Seed Innovation Grant closed in October, and we received 8 applications in this year, and a review panel has selected 4 projects for a grant. The RTA Seed Innovation Grant aims to advance the mission of the RTA by seeding innovations to build market platforms for low carbon heating and cooling, and the grant recipients will present at the RTA meeting on December 11th. And who these recipients are will be announced shortly. So just stay tuned for a press release on the grantees. In addition to the December 11th call, the RTA has scheduled a web meeting for January 16th. And the topic for this call is Market Strategies for Renewable Heating and Cooling. The web meeting will feature speakers from NYSERDA, Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I'm looking forward to an update on these strategies as well. I will now stop sharing my screen so that our speaker can share his screen. And in the meantime, I will go to the practical details. You were muted upon entry and have to unmute yourself for the Q&A section. Alternatively, send your questions through the chat function. The icon for unmuting yourself can be found in the lower left-hand corner of the Zoom window. This presentation is recorded and will be posted on YouTube and Basecamp afterwards. And then over to today's speaker. Daniel Sternberg is a senior analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, where he also manages the forecasting and modeling group in the Strategic Energy Analysis Center. Mr. Sternberg has a Master of Environmental Science from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a Bachelor in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences from Cornell University. He will present the Electrification Future Studies, which is a technical evaluation of the impacts of an electrified US energy system. And this is a multi-year study, and NREL and research partners are exploring scenarios with an impact of widespread electrification in the United States to answer important questions such as which end-use electric technologies are available, how would the electricity system need to transform, the role of demand-side flexibility, and what are the overall impacts of mass electrification. Daniel will give an overview of the the EFS and its research scope, present findings so far, and ongoing work. The presentation will be around 30 minutes before we open the microphone for questions and comments. Daniel, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Helle, and thanks for the opportunity to present to the Alliance today. Got a lot of material to cover, so I think I'm just gonna dive right in here. So I'll give an overview and motivation for the Electrification Future Study, as Helle introduces the EFS. There are really two main components that I'm gonna cover today, which are completed to date. One is the technology projection. So this is the identification of the key electric technologies that could potentially be involved in increasing electrification in the US, and developing projections for how those technologies could evolve going forward, both in terms of the cost of those technologies as well as their efficiency. The next and the bulk of the presentation will be on the demand side scenarios, analysis, and the results. And this is our work developing the actual end use adoption scenarios for those electric technologies, what that means in terms of load, both total consumption on an annual basis as well as load shapes. And then finally, I'll talk about what you can expect sort of in the near term here for the next steps of the projects, as well as what we're planning on for calendar year 2020. Okay, so a little bit of background. I don't think this will be a surprise to anybody on the call today. Electricity is obviously a terrific fuel. It has a lot of attractive attributes. It's highly transportable. Once you've developed a transmission infrastructure, you can move it from place to place at 70 and 90% of the speed of light. So getting it from here to there is very easy. It has 0 point of use emissions. So although there are indirect or upstream emissions associated with the generation of electricity in most places of the world, the point of use is 0 emissions. So it's a lot easier to control where those emissions happen. It's highly flexible and highly controllable, so it can be used for a variety of purposes. Most of these purposes is often one of the most efficient forms of use of energy to create a certain end use service. And then, although it's currently substantially expensive to store electricity, we're developing better and better capabilities to do so. Shown here in the bottom right are a pump storage facility, and of course the Tesla Powerwall on the left in the form of battery storage. And battery storage these days is sort of following the path of solar technologies that we've seen, where we're seeing relatively precipitous drops in the costs of storage in the near term. And as a result of all these benefits, electrification is pretty widespread. Across this sample of countries around the globe, we're seeing increasing shares of final energy represented by electricity as we go from the early 80s up until today. That share is increasing in most countries, but in the US, despite this increasing share of final energy being represented by electricity, overall electricity growth has slowed. On the left here, we see a plot of the share of electricity consumption by end use sector, as well as the growth rate shown by that black line, declining from over 10% in the early 1950s down to between 0 and 1% in recent years. And this is despite the fact that economic growth in the US continues to rise, and use service consumption continues to rise. And so really what we're seeing here is a change in the structure of the economy from energy intensive industries to less energy intensive industries, as well as an increase in the efficiency of all the end use devices that comprise our electricity consumption. Despite this slowing electricity consumption in the US, there may be greater electricity consumption on the rise, and this is largely due to the advancement in electric technologies. Probably the example that's most pervasive throughout the public is the widespread adoption of electric vehicles in the form of hybrids, plug-in hybrids, as well as battery electric vehicles. We're currently in a phase of exponential growth in sales of those vehicles. And so as a result of the improved electric technologies, as well as local policies and economic incentives to support the adoption of some of these technologies, the policies created to reduce emissions and improve air quality and perhaps secondary benefits such as increased energy security, we're seeing greater and greater focus on electrification. And as a result of this focus, utilities and other stakeholders, such as yourselves, are sort of carefully watching to see if electrification has the potential to increase sales and revenues, and what this really means for the U.S. power sector more broadly. So this is effectively the question that we're trying to answer is how do utility planners and operators plan for widespread electrification? What is electrification going to look like? What are the implications of electrification on the evolution and operation of the U.S. Energy system? So we've developed the Electrification Futures Study, the EFS. It's a multi-year research effort, really over 3+ years, funded by the Department of Energy to examine this question. And really, we set out to examine 5 sort of key questions. First is, what end-use electric technologies are available for the highest energy consuming service today? So what are those key electric technologies that could replace incumbent conventional fossil fuel end-use devices? And how might those technologies advance over time? So as we go from today out into 2050, can we expect substantial cost reductions? Can we expect substantial increases in the performance of these technologies? Second is, how might widespread electrification impact consumption in 2 ways? One is the overall total consumption of electricity kind of on an annual basis, but also what are those consumption patterns, both regionally and temporally. On a temporal basis, this is the diurnal consumption patterns, as well as sort of longer-term seasonal patterns. Given what we project in terms of the impacts on consumption, the third question is, how is the U.S. electricity system going to need to transform to meet these changes in load, both again in total magnitude as well as patterns? Fourth is, how can demand-side flexibility both support operations to meet load in all hours, but also how can demand-side flexibility potentially incentivize increased adoption? If you can recoup revenue through offerings to demand-side programs, will that increase the likelihood of adoption of some of these electric technologies? And then finally, what are really the economy-wide cost benefits and impacts of electrification? So this is on the emissions side, on the security side, et cetera. So the study is not NREL alone. We have a number of major collaborators, including the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI. We have a couple collaborators from Evolved Energy Research that have a big role in the demand side scenario development and modeling. Somebody from Northern Arizona University, participation from 2 other national labs, Oak Ridge and Berkeley, as well as, of course, our key funders and participants on the analysis, U.S. Department of Energy, largely the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. As I said earlier, we're about halfway through the project. Published the technology cost and performance paper at the end of last year. As of this summer, we've published 2 additional papers. One is on the demand side adoption scenarios. The other is on the DS Grid model documentation. I'm not going to talk a lot about DS Grid today, but suffice it to say that it's the model that we're using to represent end-use level loads across all sectors at the hourly basis. Okay, so let's dive into the meat here. We're going to start with the work on identifying and building out projections for technology costs and performance through time. So the purpose of this, as I said, was to develop cost and performance metrics for key end-use technologies from present day to 2050. Really, these projections were based on existing literature and data, as well as expert judgment. And what we did is develop really 3 different scenarios of technology evolution: slow, moderate, and rapid. Slow is just kind of, we have sort of business as usual trajectories in terms of the advancement of these technologies. Moderate is, we have some breakthroughs in research, and so they get substantially lower in cost, but we're not making huge breakthroughs. And then finally, rapid is obviously, we are seeing huge breakthroughs in these technologies through successful R&D, perhaps rolling out sort of new actually engineered solutions for some of these things. And so we see substantial improvements in cost and performance. The technologies we covered here are light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, buses, and the transportation sector. In the building sector, we covered air source heat pumps and developed separate projections for both air source heat pumps for mild and moderate climates, as well as those for cold climates. We also developed projections for heat pump water heaters. So really this came down to two different types of projections. One is a projection in cost, and the other is a projection in efficiency. So if we focus on the example shown on the left here for commercial air source heat pumps, on the top is showing the projections for the decline in cost. On the bottom, we're showing the coefficient of performance of those heat pumps over time. The dots actually there show some data from other studies that have developed these types of projections. So for the building sector, this relied on existing models and the projections that they use, as well as things that were developed for the standards for appliances that are developed out of the DOE. Those are the main sources for that data to compare to, but ultimately these were done sort of based on expert opinion. In addition to building up these fundamental metrics, we then sort of compile them in a suite of levelized cost metrics. Given that we're talking about a number of different end-use services in the building sector, we label those levelized cost of services for the building sector. For transportation, they're just all levelized cost of driving metrics. So these include all costs associated throughout the lifetime of the technology. So these are capital, fuel, and maintenance costs for all technologies through time, which allow us to look at them sort of on an equal footing. So given that we developed those projections, those are really sort of one of the key inputs that we needed to understand how electricity would transform through time as we built out scenarios of adoption for these different types of technologies. So for the next step in the project and for the report that we released in early summer, the overall objective here was to really develop and explore these scenarios of electrification across all end uses. And again, this is across transportation, buildings, and industry. And these scenarios, the intention is to allow us to quantify how electricity could impact total demand, how electrification could impact total demand, as well as the patterns of demand through time. And the general approach that we're using here is to develop sort of exogenous scenarios of adoption, that is changes in sales share from present day out to 2050. And then to use those scenarios to drive a stock model and an energy accounting model to understand how will those changes in sales shares play out in terms of actual penetration of the stock. The scenarios of adoption are really developed based on expert judgment as well as through existing trends. In the transportation sector, we use some adoption modeling as well. And generally, all those scenarios that we developed follow sort of a traditional adoption curve, or sort of S-curve that's shown here, where we have the invention of a technology, where it's adopted by early market adopters and sort of a niche market. Once the value of that technology is shown, it breaks into the broader market. We have rapid uptake in that technology until we hit saturation into the future. Of course, you know, how quickly each of technologies are adopted depends largely on the market and a whole number of other drivers. So that was one of the key pieces that we were developing. So here we're showing a little bit more detail on the specific approach. So again, the approach is to develop scenarios of adoption, the change in sales share. Then using a stock model, we can say, given the lifetime of an existing stock, if we're adopting at these new rates, when an individual technology is retired, what's the likelihood of adoption of a new electric technology? That plays out through time such that we can get the stock rollover. The penetration of the stock and projections of end-use service demand ultimately determine what the energy consumption is across each end use and by technology type. So for the adoption scenarios, we developed three different futures, a reference future, which is very little incremental change. We decided that it would be best to sort of basically tag this to the reference case scenario from the Annual Energy Outlook, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but if not, is the Energy Information Administration's annual projection of the evolution of the power system, both on the supply side and the load side. So our reference scenario across sectors really matches pretty closely the projection of technology adoption coming out of the National Energy Modeling System, the NEMS model, shown in the AEO reference case. The medium case really represents sort of more widespread electrification of sort of the lower hanging fruit opportunities. So these are things like light duty vehicles in the transportation sector, in the building sector. It's, you know, aggressive but not optimistic, you know, overly optimistic projections of the rate of adoption of heat pumps, air source heat pumps. And then the high scenario then is really a transformational electrification scenario. It's assuming a lot of different support for adoption of electric technologies in the form of cost breakthroughs on an R&D side, as well as supporting policy, rate structures, et cetera. These scenarios are really not, or are really expert opinion driven, so they're really qualitatively designed scenarios. There's currently not really a sufficient modeling platform that covers all three sectors here to develop this. So we were sort of largely forced into using these qualitative descriptions of scenarios. All right, so I'm going to dive in a little bit now on each of the individual sectors. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about buildings, and then we'll cover transportation and industry as well. So in the building sector, you know, there's a few key things to keep in mind in the development of these scenarios. First is that the residential commercial buildings in aggregate comprise the lowest amount of final energy across the three end-use sectors: transportation, industry, and buildings. One of the reasons is that it's the most electrified and therefore is relatively efficient compared to the other sectors. Within the building sectors, most of the unelectrified sources are in space heating and water heating in both residential and commercial buildings. Cooking is the other large real end use, and that's shown up in the other section here of the residential demand, and then it's called out explicitly on the bottom side in commercial demands. So in terms of the opportunities for electrification of the building sector, that's really what we're looking at, is replacing the fuel oil, propane, and natural gas usage in space heating and water heating, as well as gas usage for cooking. And so in the building sector, that's really what we are looking at. The primary technology that we spent a lot of time thinking about is really air source heat pumps. I figured one question that would come up on this call is, did we look explicitly at ground source heat pumps? We did not develop technology projections for ground source heat pumps in the prior technology cost and performance projection work. We focused solely on air source heat pumps. That was largely because our assessment demonstrated that we expected substantial growth in air source heat pumps with less substantial growth in ground source heat pumps, and just given some of the practicalities of research, we focused on air source heat pumps. We do include growth in ground source heat pumps in the scenarios here, but there's relatively little growth in their deployment. I think we achieved something about 3% of stock in the final scenarios, in the high scenario. So just in terms of formulating the scenario for air source heat pumps, there is a substantial penetration of air source heat pumps today. 15% of residential homes, about 9% of commercial building space relies on electric air source heat pumps. It's a little bit confusing on the right side of the graph. If you look at the all regions column, you're looking at about 15% of total square footage for commercial buildings, but that's because that bar is including both natural gas and district heat driven heat pumps in that sector. The other key thing is that that the distribution of air source heat pumps is really highly concentrated in mild climates. We have very low penetrations of these technologies in cold or very cold regions. And even in those regions, they're often not the sole technology used to provide at least the heating end use service. They're often coupled with other sort of more backup technologies or are used to offset some of the more expensive fuel consumption in those regions, such as the distillate fuel oil. Okay, so ultimately the building sector scenarios were sort of defined by climate region and split up between both commercial and residential buildings. But I have some of sort of the high level outcomes of that development shown here. So again, in the reference case, air source heat pumps adoption increases, but minimally. Sales share increases to approximately 20% in residential and 12% in commercial buildings by 2050. And this pretty much matches the projections developed, again, within the context of the Annual Energy Outlook, the 2017 version. Under the medium case, we're really exploring a much more aggressive scenario of electrification where sales share, at least in mild and warm climates, is approaching saturation at 80% in those regions. This doesn't mean that the stock's hitting that 80% number again, but just the sales share. So anytime a particular technology is retired, there's an 80% chance that an electric air source heat pump is adopted to replace an incumbent technology. In cold climates, we have increasing growth, but it's still not, the major option that is selected by customers. On the high side, on the contrary, this is really looking at a scenario where we have complete saturation of sales in mild climates and substantial penetration of air source heat pumps in cold climates. We're looking at 50% adoption rates in cold climates. This requires that cold climate heat pumps really come down in cost and or improve in efficiency such that they're really cost effective relative to the incumbent technologies. So in this high scenario, again, we're really assuming transformation of the technology. So cost breakthroughs, sort of full supply chain development. So this is increasing the availability and the facility of installation. This would require addressing things like landlord-tenant problems through things like energy service companies, policy support, incentive support. Rate structures would likely have to evolve. Any demand response programs that could create, additional value streams for owners of electric technologies. And then things like non-energy benefits are realized in terms of their safety or their controllability. Right, so this is sort of the one slide that shows the real change in the stock through time. We have the key end uses shown here: residential space heating, water heating, commercial space heating, commercial water heating, and cooking. We also have residential cooking, but it's just not shown on the slide for space reasons. So one of the key things that came out of this is that appliance lifetimes really limit total penetration. With our approach, we really basically said we're not going to retire any appliances before the end of their life. And that decision was based on current behavior that, as end use consumers of these goods, we really only replace them when the system fails. In addition, when that system fails, it's often an emergency. If your furnace goes down and you live in Colorado like I do in the winter, you need to get it replaced rapidly, which means the person is typically, the repairman is typically going to suggest a technology that individual is used to. Currently that is furnaces, boilers, etc. So there are certain barriers to that adoption which we need to overcome. The bottom line is, though, that we have a limited number of lifetimes from present day out into 2050. And so despite the fact that even in the high case, we're hitting effectively 100% adoption rates in those mild climates, that doesn't mean that we're going to get near to close to 100% of stock by that period. So overall, what we're achieving here is that electric technologies are providing up to 61% of space heating, just about half of water heating, and the predominant amount of cooking services. The more rapid adoption of the cooking services was really driven by sort of the growing recognition of the value of induction-based cooking. And so we thought that would likely take off more quickly and be likely something that customers may actually turn over prior to their lifetimes. Obviously, in order to meet some of these adoption projections, we'd have to rapidly advance the manufacturing and installation supply chain. Currently there's not nearly enough of these devices manufactured, delivered to serve this level of a market, and there'd be a lot of training requirements on the installation side. Okay, so overall key questions for the building sectors that were generated by the analysis is, first, will advancements in cold climate heat pumps really be sufficient to enable widespread adoption? DOE is heavily investing in cold climate heat pumps currently. They're looking at a whole number of alternative technologies, variable speed compressors, absorption technologies. And so I think there really is opportunity to both decrease the cost and, I think more importantly, increase the efficiency of these technologies. But there's no guarantee that we'll hit a level of cost effectiveness to drive these from a purely economic basis. And so that's really one of the key things that we think we need to look into going forward. The second is, will new technologies facilitate electrification in retrofits and new buildings? So we think it's relatively easy to hit high penetration in the new building stock. I think the big question mark is on the retrofit building stock today. We ended up not breaking down our adoption scenarios between retrofits and buildings, again, largely due to some of the practicalities of research and funding levels. But this is certainly an area for continued research in terms of further disaggregating the building stock and determining, where are really the low-cost opportunities for retrofits of existing buildings from, conventional fuels to electricity and using heat pumps. So that's something that we definitely need to look into more going forward. Third is how might challenges to building electrification really be overcome? So these are cultural acceptance, familiarity, landlord-tenant issues. What are the best options for managing those? Because if they're not dealt with, I don't think we have any likelihood of achieving these high penetration scenarios in the future. And then lastly, we need to do more work on how value streams through sort of grid-connected appliances and participation in demand response programs could affect consumer adoption. What is the real value that an Airsource heat pump, coupled with a demand-side response program could really provide to an individual customer? Is that really something that could tip the scale in favor of adoption of a heat pump over a conventional technology? Okay. I was thinking about pausing there, but let me get through the rest of this and then we can return for questions. So I'm going to just cover real briefly transportation and industrial sector, since I know you probably all have a lot of questions on the building sector. So really at the high level in transportation sector, the analysis identified a few key things I want to highlight. First is that transportation really dominates the opportunity for electrification. This is really in part because transportation currently is basically not electrified at all. It's less than 1% of total transportation needs is met with electricity. And so electrifying the vehicle fleet has huge implications on total load. Second is that the biggest area for growth is pretty obviously light duty vehicles. So these are either plug-in hybrid or battery electric vehicle cars. That will really drive the predominant amount of electrification in the transportation sector. But there is a sort of surprising opportunity for heavy duty vehicles in both the short haul applications. So these are things like garbage trucks, within city heavy duty transportation that are not going long distances and so don't need the same range as the long haul vehicles do, as well as transit buses, which are similar short distances, prime candidates for electrification, can either aren't going that far or can couple overhead charging or other methods for dealing with range challenges. So just a quick look at at the results from the transportation sector. So in the reference case, we're seeing very low penetration of electric technologies overall. Obviously, we're already adopting electric light-duty vehicles, so there is an increased growth in that end use in the reference case. But we really don't see substantial electrification up until the medium case, where we're seeing substantial growth in both light-duty cars, light-duty trucks, as well as some of those transit buses. And in the high scenario is really where we start to dive in into sort of the dominant share for those easier technologies become electric technologies, and then we start to piece out some of the heavy-duty vehicles as well. Getting to the point in the high scenarios is also a huge challenge. We're talking about 240 million light-duty plug-in electric vehicles. I think that's relative to about 560,000 plug-in vehicles in the US today. So we're talking about 3 orders of magnitude increase in electric vehicles. There's 7 million medium and heavy-duty trucks and 80,000 battery electric transit trucks. So these are huge changes in the supply chain of how we actually execute and operate our transportation sector. But overall, altogether in the high scenario, we're really talking about an electricity sort of takeover of the transportation industry, with 76% of the miles traveled coming from electricity. And finally, in addition to the supply chain for these technologies, this means a huge build out in terms of the charging station infrastructure. Across the US, we'd need 138,000 DC charging stations, 10 million non-residential plugs for light-duty vehicles. So key questions coming out of the transportation analysis: will battery costs continue to decline, and how will that really support the adoption? Is battery performance also going to continue to improve to deal with some of the big challenges like range anxiety? Second, again, and this is a behavioral one, how is consumer preference dealing with range anxiety going to change, and things like the positive side, acceleration, automation of vehicles? How might these other characteristics of electric vehicles impact consumer preference and ultimate adoption for them? Will charging infrastructure really enable electrification? Will it incentivize the adoption of these things by providing enough locations where you can actually charge your vehicles? Will there be things like overhead charging infrastructure developed for the short-haul heavy-duty vehicle fleet to enable that electrification? And then finally, how will ownership models and the real evolution of transportation more broadly impact this? So are we really going to end up in an economy where we have shared vehicles? Will self-driving vehicles owned by a single owner accelerate the adoption by having a single decision point for fleets of 1,000 or millions of vehicles? Industrial sector. So the industrial sector was really the most challenging from an analytical perspective. This was largely due to data. There's very sparse data available for industrial sector. On top of that, how evolution occurs in the industrial sector is a little bit different than how it occurs in buildings and transportation. So first, the industrial sector experienced sort of a large period of electrification and sustained growth up until really the 90s. So this is from the beginning of the industrial revolution up until sort of the mid-century into the 1990s. But since then has been relatively flat. And the adoption of electric technologies is sort of really, it cascades through industry relatively quickly. Once technology is shown to have a cost or productivity benefit, it basically spills through the industry, not instantaneously, but much more quickly than the sort of typical adoption curves we see at the customer level. So where there was clear opportunity and data for us to look at was in the process heating world, and so that's what was really focused on. This shows the brief set of results in the reference medium high case. So this is really where we saw the lowest penetration of electrification. Even in the high case, you see that heat pumps really provide just a small amount of process heat but then we're using other types of electric technologies to provide curing and drying. These are things like infrared and ultraviolet heating. Overall, in that high case, we hit 63% of curing needs, about a third of total drying services, and about half of process heat service. And again, in industrial processes, the overall energy consumption, the cost of energy consumption, typically makes up a small portion of the total cost of production. And so really what would drive these decisions is increases in productivity or quality of the product produced. And so the real question we think for industry is, will the productivity benefits really overcome the potentially higher costs of electric technologies? Second is, can cost-effective technologies for high-temperature applications be developed? Most of the process heat and drying and curing processes that we looked at are really lower temperature technologies, and so there's a much more limited set of technologies that can actually provide a very high temperature heat for industrial applications. And so developing those technologies would be another major breakthrough in the industrial side. And then finally, what's the interplay between equipment lifetimes and manufacturer profit-driven decisions? We're talking about massive capital investments when a manufacturer switches from one technology to the next, and so there needs to be a clear win if you're going to retire any of this equipment early. The other thing is that changing these technologies may actually require re-engineering of your whole manufacturing line, which sort of further creates barriers for adoption. Okay, so just a few slides now on what's the overall effect on total load. So this slide shows historical evolution of load across sectors, and then what we're projecting going forward. So again, we mentioned this early, vehicle electrification is really dominating the potential for electricity load growth from electrification. What we see here is under the reference case, we see sort of BAU changes in load. So this is less than 1%, a compound annual growth rate from now into 2050. So very modest, medium at about 1.2, and the high at about 1.6% per year. This looks extremely high to a lot of folks. If you say, oh, we're expecting, almost a 40% increase in load relative to a reference case, but really this is just business as usual when you look at the rates, the load growth over the past 60 years. In fact, over the past 60 years, we're looking at much more of like a 3% overall average annual growth rate. And so this is business as usual in the utility sector, just not business as usual from the recent past. Despite the fact that vehicles are really driving this growth in overall consumption, buildings are really having a big impact on when the load occurs. So what this shows is the overall size of the peak demand, and this is shown by the size of the circles here on the maps. And then the wedges indicate the portion of the top 100-hour load hours of the year that occurs in the different seasons. So in 2015, we see that almost everywhere, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest, where there's already a high penetration of electric heating, we see predominantly summer peaking loads with a little bit of peak in the fall in other areas. And then as we move to 2050, there's really two things that you notice. One is that there's growth in the area of those circles, so overall peak demand is increasing. We're estimating about 33% increase in peak load. But more importantly, we're seeing a lot more peaking hours in the winter seasons, in the winter and fall seasons. So you're seeing in New England, in the Southeast, where we're seeing increasing penetration of air source heat pumps and the electricity required to drive those air source heat pumps, we're seeing those winter peak hours. And that means that we need to evolve the power system, the supply side of the power system, much more differently to meet that load shape going forward. So this slide just puts our study in the context of a whole number of other electrification studies that were done from EIA, EPRI, E3, White House study, something from Brattle, from GCAM, from the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Sternberg et al. Is another study that I did that was really a potential study. And then the 3 different scenarios. So basically, the medium scenario here is really consistent with studies that look more at sort of what is economical levels of electrification, whereas our high study is more on the higher end of those, or starting to push to what the sort of transformational studies, similar to my study, the Sternberg et al., that really looked at technical potential to do so. That study really looked at if we electrified everything we possibly could across the end uses, ignoring behavioral and economic barriers, what would that mean in terms of load? And so that one's a little bit of an outlier there. In terms of the electricity share of final energy, we're looking at a doubling of that share from 2016 to 2050 under the high scenario, and we're seeing substantial growth across all sectors here, irrespective of transportation, industry, commercial, residential. So really, electricity is growing quite drastically. And as a result of this, end-use consumption of fuels is substantially coming down. On the biggest impact here on the transportation side, 75% reduction in gas consumption, 30% reduction in diesel, and 37% reduction in natural gas. So real quick, and then we can turn to questions. So next steps, I mentioned the DS grid model early on. So we developed effectively a new model or a new kind of tool for bottom-up analysis of loads. So the demand-side grid model really couples together a lot of bottom-up engineering models of load in the different sectors and allows us to aggregate all of that information into a single source where we can project load shapes at the hourly level by region throughout the U.S. So it's sort of a static model. So we assume certain demands for end-use services, and then we tell the model what technologies are providing those end-use services, and this model gives us information on the hourly load by end-use that would occur as a result of that system of end-use devices. So this is really going to go drive a lot of the next key step of our analysis, which is the supply-side evolution. And this is examining how the supply side of the power system gets from today out into 2050, given these transformational changes in load. Following that, we're going to be working on both the impact side. So this will be looking at economy-wide impacts on fuel, on emissions, on security, on economic growth, as well as our detailed analysis of electric system operations. So I think I'll pause there, and thanks everybody for listening, and turn to questions. I do want to acknowledge Trumai in particular, who's leading all of this work, who I'm kind of standing in for today, as well as a broad team of other analysts that have worked on this. So with that, I'll pause and see if there's any questions out there.
Well, thank you, Daniel. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any. There's some discussion also on the chat function, and I guess a lot of the comments are related to the last presentation or the last slides that you went through, how the different technologies impact on the winter peak and what cost that would imply on the power grid. And one question is related to whether you have taken into consideration the cost and benefit impacts of the various technologies on the power grid.
Right. So both great questions. So that's really where we're at in our analysis now. So I guess similar questions, but so right now we are kind of wrapping up our analysis of the expansion of the power system. So the next step is we have all the load information now, what the load shapes look like by year from present day out into 2050. And so that's first driving our capacity expansion analysis, which is actually what I spend most of my time doing. And the idea there is what technologies do we have to buy, where do we put them, and when, in order to meet load, ensure that we're meeting load at every hour from present day out to 2050, right? And so that is, are we building solar, are we building wind, are we building gas, et cetera, in order to meet this load given projections of cost of these technologies, given projections of fuel costs for these technologies, as well as given projections of evolution of environmental policy and how that impacts the grid. So we have not published that work yet. We're just wrapping up some of the analysis. We'll be starting to present on that really over the next few months. We expect to publish that, I think, by the end of the first quarter of calendar year 2019. Did that answer the question on the expansion side? I don't know if anybody wants to pipe in, but on the operational side, that follows on the capacity expansion analysis. So once we have an idea of different scenarios of how the power system will evolve into the future in terms of what's invested in, that model, the model that we're using is called the Regional Energy Deployment System, the REDS model, informs investment through kind of a reduced form estimate of how the system will operate. So if you're making investment decisions, you know, for the whole U.S. power system, we can't possibly consider, you know, 8,760 hours of load per year for all regions from present day out to 2050, just because of computational limit. So what our approach is to make an investment pathway decision using sort of a reduced form understanding of what operations will look like. And then once we have that future system in 2050, we look at operations in a lot more detail to ensure that the power system that we've built out actually operates effectively down to the 5-minute level. So we take that built out system in 2050, we use that to create a power system in what's called a security constrained unit commitment and dispatch model. And we actually operate the full US grid nodally at a 5-minute dispatch level, you know, with that set of investments and with the load shapes that we've developed. So that gives us a really detailed picture of what operations look like. Are there actually operational challenges? Are we dropping load in particular hours of the year? And what are the costs associated with operating that system?
Okay, any questions?
Yeah, hello, I've got one. This is Bob Wyman.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the concerns that a lot of people have about air source heat pumps is that, of course, they're least efficient on the coldest days as well as the hottest days. The reason we have summer peak largely is because we've got, you know, air conditioners and air source heat pumps running for cooling.
Yep.
But if we replace the fossil fuels with air source heat pumps in the winter, and, you know, on the coldest days up in a place like New York, their low end efficiency ends up being awful close to 1. You know, they're basically electric resistance heating. While the consumption of electricity may only double or so, the capacity of the delivery system, the grid itself, to handle peak load on the coldest days, even with cold climate air source heat pumps, it looks like, you know, we need to quadruple or even multiply by 6 times the capacity in order to deliver the electricity. You know, right. They may work fine during other times of the day, but the issue is really the peak consumption, and the peak consumption for air source is dramatically higher than the peak consumption for something like ground source heat pumps. The real question I've got is, can we actually afford to convert large portions of our grid over to air source heat pumps? Because to do so means literally billions, if not, you know, more dollars of investment in new delivery capacity, transmission and distribution, independent of our ability to generate the electricity.
Right, yeah. So, okay, so a few comments. So one is this is one of the things we're analyzing now in terms of what are we going to build, and then how is it going to operate, and what are those, you know, really detailed operational impacts. So given what peak load is going to look like regionally, how are we actually going to meet that with the supply side technologies? Are we really going to be having to build, you know, 100 different, you know, 500 megawatt CTs, combustion turbines, across the U.S. just so we can operate them, for 3 weeks of the year, 4 hours of the day. It seems like a relatively large capital investment just to meet that sort of peak in load. But I think there's two things that we are considering. One is we have our adoption scenarios, which are defining, the overall change in sales share and therefore the stock of the end-use devices, so the Airsource heat pumps. And we have our reference mid and high, so we get to different penetrations of those. But then we're actually running for the evolution of the power system, the full matrix of those adoption scenarios with the technology cost and performance scenarios. So not only are we going to run, let's assume substantial cost and performance improvements of cold climate heat pumps coupled with high adoption of them, we're also going to say, what if we have high adoption and we don't have much in the way of improvements for those technologies? Which means, as you said, that's going to mean we're basically running electric resistance heating for those peak hours in New England, or for those winter hours in New England and New York. And so it's going to require a lot larger increase in load than if we're assuming these sort of breakthroughs in technologies for cold climate heat pumps. So we will capture those costs, but that'll be a result of both the supply side, the expansion analysis, as well as the operational analysis. So we're not quite there yet, but I think we should have enough to inform that discussion.
Could I just, when you do that, could I just suggest, please, you talked about generation capacity in your comments there. Please understand that generation capacity is sort of the least of the problem. The real problem we have is the transmission and distribution capacity, which is vastly more expensive than the generation capacity. We already have parts of New York, for instance, where it doesn't matter how much electricity you can generate. We cannot get enough electricity into places like Brooklyn, Queens, and we have to do extraordinary things to reduce demand because we just can't afford to get the electricity in there, even if it was free.
Yeah. So our approach to these studies is sort of you can kind of think of it as like an integrated traditional utility integrated resource plan, kind of maybe on steroids in a bit. So we run our capacity expansion, which models zonal transmission capacity. So it has sort of bulk flows between regions. And so that can identify only really at a bulk level if there are transmission constraints. And that model will then select to build new transmission and incur the cost of building transmission. But more fundamentally, when we take the outputs from the capacity build out and put that into our operational model and run unit commitment and dispatch down to the 5-minute level, that allows us to identify any severe transmission constraints down to the 5-minute level. Where this study will stop short of is running AC power flow analysis, which is really to understand grid stability in terms of frequency stability and voltage stability. But we will the production cost analysis will identify if there are severe transmission constraints and the model's choosing to sort of drop load. We will then know that we actually have to develop new transmission capacity, and then we may cycle back with the expansion analysis to say, this scenario is all going grand, but in order to really meet load with this build out, you're going to have to build a whole bunch of additional transmission whose costs you weren't considering, and so we'll add additional constraints to that model to get kind of a rebuild out of that world. But suffice it to say is that transmission congestion associated with this load and the future build out of the power system will address transmission congestion.
Good. I have a couple of questions from the chat. I'll just do that.
Okay.
So one is related to larger systems like electrification of district heating, and especially weighting the COP of individual homes heat pumps versus larger heat pumps that could utilize high quality heat sources, resulting in a high COP. So that's one question. I'll add the second one at the same time, and that would relate to the costs of natural gas and fossil fuel, or fossil fuels generally, and that's related to the risk of, for instance, gas explosions, and whether costs have been, that type of cost has been taken into consideration, or whether you would have that topic on your agenda to analyze.
Okay. So just to summarize, so it's, do we think about sort of district level air source heat pumps is the first one. And the second one is about concerns about gas costs and other, potential impacts of a gas economy.
Yeah, like risk
Okay.
of explosions. And, you know, that could quantify through, for instance, an insurance premium.
Right. And I realize we are at the end of the hour here. I can hang on for a while still. I blocked off my calendar for a bit, so as long as folks are good, I can keep going. So we did not put much thought into sort of expanding district level heating or centralized heating with air source heat pumps. The reason being, in most places of the U.S., there's not existing infrastructure to support that. There are certainly, I think, a lot of cases where it could make sense, where there is existing infrastructure on university campuses, particularly older ones who still have a centralized heating system. But that wasn't something we explicitly examined. So we were really thinking in the context of, single and multifamily homes, as well as commercial buildings where you have one or multiple units, depending on the size of the building, and really providing enough service for sort of individual adoption. If there's input on, how district heating could play into this, I think we'd sort of welcome that feedback. On the gas side, so I've not been as involved with the development of the supply side build out scenarios. Typically when we're running these, we do run sensitivities on fuel costs. I'm sure we'll be running those. I think the extent to which they're reported on depends on how interesting those outputs, those results look. So we typically run the reference low and high resource cost case coming out of the annual energy outlook. They're really defined by low and high resource, oil and gas resource availability. So that's on the cost side. So I can't say that we are directly considering, potential disasters associated with, gas infrastructure and the challenges they've had in California. But I guess I'd say one of the motivations for an electrified economy in the scenarios that we are building out are those sort of secondary benefits like increased safety and controllability associated with electricity. So when we're, qualitatively thinking about these high adoption scenarios, recognition of those ancillary benefits, or maybe you don't want to call them ancillary, those benefits is certainly, within the framework.
Great. Well, thanks for.
Hello, can I ask another if he's willing to hang around?
Are you willing to hang around, Daniel?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, yeah. I'm curious about gas, because you said, for instance, that you're relying on the annual energy outlook, which of course focuses primarily on the cost of the commodity, the gas, oil, or whatever itself, and doesn't look that much at the cost of the distribution grid. We've got an odd situation here that we're beginning to be very, very concerned about in New York, in that our gas utilities, because of historical practice, typically recover their costs for gas infrastructure over 60 to 85 years, or in some cases more. And, that's assuming that basically that the infrastructure is going to last as it has historically. But if you're talking about, I think you estimated a 37% gas, reduction in gas consumption by 2050. That's going to result in an impairment of those assets and some stranded assets, and it's going to result in an increase in the in the cost, in the rates anyway, for delivery, independent of whatever the rates are for the commodity itself. And the concern is that if, in fact, we continue gas expansion, what we're going to see essentially is eventually a death spiral. As gas consumption goes down, but we're still trying to wait, 85 years to recover the cost of the assets. The people who are left on the gas system end up paying a greater share of the, it's an intergenerational cost shift. So they end up paying a greater share of the costs, and thus we end up with a death spiral. And I'm wondering if your analysis will look at, for instance, the intersector impacts as we build up the electric system to handle the load from heat pumps. That's reducing revenue for the gas industries, and thus creating stranded assets and impaired assets.
Right. So we're not going to fully address these questions, particularly once you get down to the distribution scale. I think the one piece that we will do well is look at responsiveness in the supply side of the power sector. So to the extent that the consumption side is going down, on the end use consumption, ignoring the power generation sector, is going down by 37%. That will overall decrease the costs of natural gas, right? It'll suppress the price. So what we are modeling that. We do have price responsiveness within our supply side model. So we are looking at, given that there's this decrease in the rest of the economy, the price that's facing the power sector is much lower. And so we are seeing an increase in the build out of the power sector gas fleet in response to that. Relative to if we just hold prices fixed based on an AEO projection. So that is another scenario that we're exploring. So overall, what we're seeing at this point is that we're not seeing a huge impact on economy-wide gas consumption, but just this decrease in the end use side, which is being largely made up for on the power side. But we're still running those scenarios and getting details from the model.
Right, but
I think
what you're talking about though is commodity cost. What I'm talking about is the distribution cost, the gas utilities, the pipes in the ground, for instance. Their costs are being recovered over 85 years, but we're going to have within 32 years a 40% reduction in sales.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So I think that will likely all be addressed in the cost and impacts reporting. We're not going to do any quantitative modeling of the distribution system and cost recovery, but we'll address that in terms of the overall impacts of an electrification scenario, and again, what are the costs and the benefits, and certainly stranded assets is going to be a big part of that conversation, or I should say the potential for stranded assets.
Okay, so many thanks, Daniel, for staying on longer. Also, thanks to all of the rest of you staying on the call, holding on longer. And we are, at least I am looking forward to the report coming out in the beginning of 2019. And then I just want to welcome you back in December for the next RTA web meeting. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you, Helen. And I can just say, folks do have more questions that are unanswered. Feel free to reach out to me or to True. And again, the demand scenarios are all available online already. The data and the report as well. Same thing with the technology cost and performance projections. And yeah, look forward to the supply side build out in first quarter of calendar year 19. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Bye all.